Thank you for tuning in. No one has been more tolerant or even had the opportunity to express any existence of courage than the Larry Hamm that I know, who is here with us today. Most of the people who have really gotten involved with raising issues have been predominantly involved with it for their own self-purposes. Mr. Hamm has been very instrumental in providing opportunities for individuals to not only speak out the interests that they have in wanting to see change, but has also been one of the major components of urging the types of changes that are necessary for our community. Mr. Hamm has been involved with a number of different issues and has been the pinnacle of success towards elevating the type of consciousness that's necessary for our young community to know that we do still have individuals who are interested in knowing exactly what we need to do to have positive leadership in our community. Mr. Hamm, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Herb.
You know, I've been a fan of yours. And, you know, it's interesting when we talk about fans. What I have wanted to do is emulate you in many respects, because you embody the kind of inspiration that I've always wanted to have when it came down to being a true model of a image maker. And that has really given me a lot of courage in relationship to what has happened to me since really transitioning from the New York area into New Jersey. And you've been consistent since the very first day that I've met you. But your humble attitude has really made me feel compassionate about seeing whatever it is that I can do to be a part of what it is that you know is important for our lifestyles and certainly the generations to come after us. It's really important that we focus on some of the relevant concerns that are happening. The crime rate is still escalating, and certainly black on black crime hasn't changed. When I first started working in this media environment, black on black crime was one of the areas that I wanted to focus on targeting. But it's been very difficult trying to see what we can do to come up with concepts to change those issues. What really is the problem, and how have we been failing to identify with it to stop it?
That's a very good question, and a lot of people wish they had the answers. First of all, the issue of crime in our community is a multidimensional issue. There's no single root cause. There are primary roots, and even these are interrelated to one another. I think the simplest way to answer the question is wherever you have poverty, you have crime. And that's across the board. I don't care which racial group, which ethnic group you're talking about, whether you're talking about here in the United States, whether you're talking about Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, where you have high rates of poverty, you have high rates of crime. Crime is the handmaiden of poverty. It is no accident that the latest Census Bureau statistics show that nearly half of Newark's population lives either near, at, or below the poverty level. That in fact, 44% of the children in Newark up to age 18 live in poverty. And in conditions like that, you're going to find high crime rates. Now this is also compounded by other problems that we have. In general, in the United States, we live in what criminologists call a criminogenic society. We live, in fact, in a society that creates crime because it creates in people needs and desires for material goods for which they do not have access. And when these desires become strong enough, people are going to find a way to try and get those material goods. And then that problem is also compounded by the fact that we have a legal system which in and of itself also creates and adds to the crime rate. For instance, in New York City, 700,000 people were stopped and frisked by the police. In many instances, they were ticketed. In many instances, they were arrested. Even with just tickets, people's name and information becomes entered into the criminal database. So it's a situation. It's almost like a good example would be the pass law system that South Africa had under apartheid. In a legal arrangement like that, almost every citizen, every black citizen in South Africa would become a criminal, because at one time or another, someone would forget their passbook. And at that point, they may be stopped by a police person, and at that point, they would be arrested or penalized for not having their passbook. So we have a very complex situation. And I might add another dimension to this. We talk about crime, and we talk about the high rates of crime as if it is something new. It's only new to us in the present. If you go back and read W.E.B. Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro, which he wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, Du Bois talks about the black ghetto in Philadelphia and how there were high rates of crime there. In fact, alcoholism and even drug addiction of some types were already evident in black ghettos at the turn of the century. Remember, opium, which is the basis of heroin, is not new to the United States. It's been here since the middle of the 19th century. At the end of the Civil War, many soldiers were morphine addicts because morphine was the painkiller that was administered on the battlefield and was continually given to soldiers. So many became morphine addicts. So drug addiction, crime, these are not new things. In fact, if people remember, I believe it was Roman Polanski's film, The Gangs of New York. In that picture, which in many ways was fictional, but fiction based on the truth about New York City in the 19th century, you see the same problems plaguing the ethnic groups that occupied the ghettos before African Americans became the predominant groups in those ghettos. And you see the same problems that we face today face those groups. Here is the difference. The difference is that they had a ladder up. The ghetto was only a stop along the way. White supremacy and white skin privilege allowed them to move up and out of the ghettos, whereas racism, both institutional, both overt and covert racism, kept us in the ghettos, kept us in the slums. And these problems that would have been at one level for one generation became compounded because you had generation after generation living in poverty.
Thinking in terms of the relative opportunity that we have now to change those dynamics, and looking at it from the perspective of how the legal concepts of our, system really creates the class that really becomes a subclass of the cultures that exist within these communities. Where do we really find the promise for change?
Well, I think the promise for change can be found in those groups, in those churches, in those mosques, in those religious institutions, in those communities where people are trying to fight crime in their own way, where people are trying to instill the right values in our young people, where people are trying to send a message that we shouldn't engage in crime, and especially we shouldn't hurt our own community and our own people. That's where we find the promise. In the previous explanation that I gave, I don't want to seem like a disconnected academic, but we have to look at the problem both with a microscope and both with a telescope. On the one hand, we have to understand the macro causes of some of these problems. Poverty, unemployment. I mean, is it any accident that as unemployment has increased in our community, crime has also increased. It's no accident. But at the same time, while we understand the macro causes of the problem, we cannot negate the micro responsibilities that we have. Just because we live in poverty, it does not mean we have to. It does not mean it is impossible for us not to adopt these values. I grew up in a poor family. I grew up in a single parent family. My father didn't leave. My father died at a very young age. I was raised on First Ridgewood Avenue in Newark, and then South 12th Street in Newark, the Central Ward of Newark. I grew up in Newark, and there were others like me who grew up, who were able to find their way through high school, graduate high school, go to college, and eventually get a job and become productive citizens. It can still be done. But at the same time, while we recognize some have the ability to make it, and make it in large part through their individual efforts, there are many others who are not, and we should not turn our backs on them. And we should be mindful of the fact that we must do more to make sure that things don't become worse. I mean, right now, one of the main things that we could do to fight poverty, to fight crime, is to fight poverty. And one of the main ways to fight poverty is to do something about unemployment. We're now at depression level unemployment in the United States. There are 26 million people unemployed, twice as many people as were unemployed during the Depression in the 1930s. Black unemployment has been at depression level now for years. We're at 15.5%. That's the official figure. That's 1.5 times depression level unemployment. We need a national jobs program to put people back to work. Because if we don't, it's going to get worse. If people don't have jobs, people don't have money, this crime situation is going to get worse. And you can see it in your everyday life as you move around the community. You see more people begging on the streets now than you ever have. If you go to any McDonald's, any Burger King, almost every fast food restaurant that's in the black community, there are going to be people there either asking you to buy them something to eat or asking for money. And you see it more and more. You go to the post office, people stand like sentinels on guard at the post office. It wasn't like this 35, 40 years ago. It's like this now because the economic situation is worse than it's ever been. And it amazes me that the crime is not even higher. I mean, of course, it's high enough. We lament the high crime rate that we have, but I'm surprised it's not even higher than it is.
Looking at the idea of the fact that organizations have been the pinnacle of making sure that those issues are relevant to our communities. People Organization for Progress and many organizations that have been able to highlight the issue in terms of raising awareness have been pretty adequate. But we talked about the issue of Dr. Martin Luther King and the relationship of how the struggle in regard to changing the paradigm of failure in our communities were really created under the concept of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference because of the fact that the NAACP was alienated.
Right.
But what really showed promise in terms of making the changes was not so much in regard to the protest, but the organization in terms of how they were able to create community economics. What are we doing to really replicate that kind of planning?
Well, that's interesting. First of all, I do want to say something about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was created after the conclusion of the Montgomery bus boycott. Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. It started in December of 1955, right after Rosa Parks was arrested, and it continued through almost to the end of 1956. In fact, it was, I believe, January of 1957, Dr. King created SCLC. But why did Dr. King create SCLC? One of the reasons why Dr. King created SCLC was because the NAACP had been outlawed. It had been outlawed. It had been proclaimed by the state legislature of the state of Alabama to be a subversive organization, and many other things they said at that time. And they outlawed it because it had been the vehicle by which black people were trying to fight against segregation. So King created SCLC. By the way, Fred Shuttlesworth, even before SCLC, had created a human rights organization. But had the NAACP not been outlawed, it's a question as to whether or not SCLC would have come into being. I think your question is, what are we doing around promoting community economics? And that's a good question. The entrepreneurial spirit is very strong in our community. There are young people today who have their own businesses. I see young men that are opening businesses downtown Newark and on the different avenue here, storefront businesses, and that's good. And I think the entrepreneurial spirit will always be there. It's in some people. They're gonna make a way. You know, they're gonna survive through their own skills and abilities. And quite frankly, I encourage entrepreneurship. I mean, even among people who already have, say, if they have jobs in the private sector, jobs in the public sector, it doesn't hurt to have a little business on the side, because the way people are being laid off and factories are being closed and post offices are being closed, you know, it's good to have something to fall back on. So I encourage the entrepreneurial spirit. There's always this gap between perception and reality. Under segregation, and it's important to keep in mind that segregation didn't exist just in the South. It also existed in the North. And I mean really existed. I mean, we may not have had the white and color signs, but segregation was real here in the North. In fact, I was interviewed for a film about Baxter Terrace the other day. And well, the film was about housing, I think. It's going to be about housing in Newark. And one of the researchers on the film pointed out to me that Baxter Terrace, right over here, just blocks away from us, was federally segregated. That the federal government, Baxter Terrace was a federal housing development, and the rules from the housing authority were that blacks were to live in one part of this housing development and whites were to live in the other part of the housing development. Now, there weren't any signs up, but those were the rules. And Newark very much had redlining. In fact, before the Central Ward was called the Central Ward, it was called the Third Ward, and the wards had numbers. Most black folks lived in the old Third Ward because of redlining. You couldn't buy a house in the North Ward. At one point, you couldn't even buy, you wouldn't know it now, but the South Ward of Newark used to be almost all Jewish, and you couldn't buy a home over there. But after the rebellions, many of those that lived over there left those homes, and as Mildred Crump said last night in the program we were at, they got their homes on pennies on the dollar, you know. So segregation was real. And when we had segregation, we had more black businesses because we couldn't go elsewhere. This was the truth, you know. So there was this not just perception, there was a reality, and the perception was bolstered by the reality that we had more black businesses. Well, once segregation ended, you know, and black folks could go shop different places, and, you know, many of these businesses went out of business, you know, but some people still maintain their businesses. We still have a number of small businesses owned and run by black people in the black community, but not as many as we did at one time. And a lot of that, of course, has to do not just with the end of segregation, but it also has to do with being a small business person. Most small businesses don't have a life beyond 5 years. You know, small businesses are created every day and others go out of business every day. So it's a kind of cycle.
Well then, but how do we balance this idea of community economics to the extent, because in terms of the relationship that we have learned from the Occupy Wall Street or the Occupy Newark or the Occupy San Francisco, their concept is basically we're going to now take control of those businesses that have closed and create our own businesses. And in one vein, yeah, it's a great idea. In another vein, you know, there should be some type of respect for, you know, the manner in which you are representing it. You just can't go and take over something because you want to.
Right.
But the mindset has obviously provided a need that it's necessary for us to seek changes in policy,
Right.
so that those relationships can exist. When I spoke earlier about the class system,
Right.
we know that an individual who, for instance, makes the mistake in their life and they create a felon and then they're released from prison, they're still going to be a second-class citizen for the rest of their life. There is no redemption. And then even an individual who doesn't create a felony have other conditions that are there that is going to keep them from getting an opportunity to become independently wealthy. How do we take the concept of the Operation Breadbasket, the concept of being able to create the types of improvements of economics in our communities and apply it to be sustainable today, even in light of the fact that we're going to need government intervention to make it happen?
Well, first of all, at the most basic level, black folks should support black businesses. That's a
something we have been taught to look for the best deal. And sometimes even the black business don't have the best deal.
That's true.
How can you really get someone to feel that they're going to be committed to an environment that may not give them the kind of benefit that they're looking for, regardless of what culture it is?
Right. Well, I still feel that black folk, as much as possible, should support black businesses. I mean, we patronize many different kinds of businesses. So whereas there may be a scarcity of black business in one line of commerce, there might be something in another line. So there's always something we can do. For instance, how many of us subscribe to black publications?
Sure.
Newspapers, magazines. That's like at the basic level, you know. And then how many of us buy our books from black bookstores? You know, that's another level. And then you work your way up, you know. The funny part about it is what you said earlier can actually work in reverse. Sometimes black people will pay more just to buy. It could be the same product, but they feel for some reason there's a psychological level of
that it's better.
That's right. It's better.
Yeah.
Like what did black folks used to say? the white man's ice is cooler.
You're right.
They wouldn't buy ice.
He
from
had the better ice.
Yeah. Right. White man's ice is cooler.
Right.
You know. So we got to try and break through
Right.
that mindset and support black business as much as we can. The second thing is we have to encourage the entrepreneurial spirit among our young people. You know, we should not only say get a good job, but figure out a way, you know, to make a job for yourself. And for instance, when I was a kid, we had junior achievement. I don't think they have that anymore. I was actually president of 2 different junior achievement companies in 2 different years. One was sponsored by Bamberger's and one was sponsored by Prudential. And we made little products and we went out and sold them in the community. And that taught me something about business. We need a kind of black junior achievement where we encourage and show young people, expose young people to business practices. For instance, how many black business people are invited into schools to talk to students about the businesses that they own and run?
Right.
You know?
Okay. So in essence, what we were talking about now is really building a true confidence of people having a pride in who they are and being specific about it. And I agree with you, Larry, because a lot of what has been going on has been really politically correct. We have to talk about an integrated society, not a concept of what we are going through as black people, but that the only way it is going to get some type of leverage is that it has to encompass everyone. But shouldn't we begin to really focus on prioritizing our concerns around our issues based upon our culture?
Sure. I mean, if we're not concerned about ourselves, who will be? In fact, people are more concerned about people that show concern and respect for themselves, you know? If you don't respect yourself and show concern for yourself, it's very difficult for other people to do the same. So on the issue of business, encourage entrepreneurship.
But on the issue of black power,
okay.
I mean, this is where I'm headed here.
Okay. Well,
I'm honestly talking about the relevancy of what has been happening in regard to how it has not shown improvement based upon the fact that if we do develop a black consensus of development, that we are going to be put into a pragmatic position, that it's either going to be considered to be prejudice or there's going to be some repercussions behind it. When I'm looking at what's happening, for instance, the days of protest that you have created to raise awareness around an issue that really helped elevate African Americans to a better state of citizenship. Responsible citizenship has to be applied in regard to the cultural aspects of a people. And what I'm thinking of really trying to bring into existence in our conversation is the relevancy of why it is important to know that this is about black pride, being who you are and knowing that you can be better based upon the fact of who you are. And so if we can identify to beyond the protest, beyond pointing out what the problems are, and idealistically saying that if we encourage an understanding that this problem is based upon the lack of relationship that we have because of who we are, that we can build a better promise for our community.
Right. It's interesting that you said that because the other day I was listening to Dr. King, and he was talking about the importance of black history. And I know a lot of people don't identify that with Dr. King, but that's only because folks don't know the full scope of his thought. And he was talking about the importance of black history. And he said that any program that did not teach black people about their own culture and their own history, and to teach them to have respect for themselves and the need for group unity, he said that program was doomed to fail. And those were his words. So we understand that this group identity and group self-respect and group unity, first and foremost, it's as American as apple pie. It's only put up as foreign because we live in a white supremacist society. So anything that's gonna kind of help black people to be equal, is going to be put kind of in a negative light, because we live in a society, we live in a white supremacist society. Racism is still real. We still live in a situation where we have to work constantly against the negative portrayal of ourselves. So that's important. But, you said black power, which is something that's usually applied to the political realm. And we've had 40 years now of black power, 40 years of black elected officials. And that's important because most communities have representatives that reflect their communities.
Right.
When the Italians were dominant in Newark, they had Italians, and Jews were dominant. The mayor was Jewish. Irish was dominant. Irish were Jewish. that's kind of the way things are. It only becomes something foreign and something scary, you know, because black people advocate it. And because we live in a white supremacist society, anything that's going to try to equal things out is going to be put in a negative light. But we have to constantly push. And I know some people say, well, why haven't we had more progress? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the problems that we face run much deeper than the political system. They run into the nature and the way the economic system functions and the way the economic system relates to us. And until we make some corrections down in the base, you know, these other things, like until we really grapple with the problem of poverty and the problem of unemployment in our community, crime is going to get worse. Now, you can bring a lot of police in, you can bring the National Guard in, which some people were talking about some years ago, and you can lock a whole lot of folks up. But believe me, you'll have a temporary lull in crime, but it'll creep back up. It'll creep back up, which is what we've seen in Newark. You had this real, you know, heavy police presence, lock people up for almost everything and anything, and for a moment, the homicide rate dropped a few percentage points. But now it's back up to where it was before. Because why? Poverty is increased from where it was at the end of 1999 or in 2000. You know, I mean, our cities are increasingly becoming reservations of the poor and dispossessed. And and this was Dr. King's message. That's why, you know, at the end of his life, he was working on three things: racism, poverty, and war. Those were the three issues that he was concerned about, you know, and he said very clearly that, you know, it's hard for a lot of people to understand, but Dr. King talked about this crime issue in our community too. It's not a new issue.
Right.
It's not new.
Well, let me talk about the issue that you have developed, the Days of Protest with the People's Organization for Progress. Expound upon it. Explain exactly the synergy of it.
Right. Well, again, for some years we've been dealing with this issue, unemployment, poverty in our community, and we were talking about, well, what can we do differently to draw attention to this problem that we haven't done before? So the idea that we came up with daily protests for jobs. We had one campaign around the issue of Earl Faison where we had 45 days of protest because Earl Faison was killed in 45 minutes from the time that he was taken into custody by the Orange Police. And those police, as you know, were convicted. First time in history of New Jersey that I know of 5 police were simultaneously convicted in connection with a police brutality incident. They were convicted and they went to jail. The unfortunate thing was they weren't convicted of murder. And as far as we're concerned, the case is still open. We found that 45 days of protest to be effective. That's one precedent. The other precedent was the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for 381 days. So we said, let's do daily protests to draw attention to the problem of unemployment in our community and other problems. So we started on January the 27th. We decided that we would continue for 381 days. Today would be day 207, our 207th day, and July 15th will be the 381st day. And we started out on this as POP, but since we started out, as of today, we have the endorsement of 161 organizations. The object of those organization endorsements being to have each organization come and join us for one day, just one day of the 381 days. And some organizations have come out already, and we hope all the rest will come out before the campaign is over. And as I said, there's 7 core demands. 1, we want a national jobs program to put the unemployed and underemployed back to work now. 2, we want an end to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, use the money being spent on war for domestic spending. 3, protect workers' rights to unionize and collectively bargain. 4, moratorium on home foreclosures. 5, universal single payer health care for everybody, health insurance for everybody in the country. 6, stop the privatization of our public schools. And 7, make college education affordable and end student debt. So those are the 7 core things that we've been out there for every day.
What is the definition of Larry Hamm?
Oh, what is the definition? Well, Larry Hamm is a black man that grew up in Newark and who's still very much concerned about his community and wants to build a movement for social change, not only in Newark, in this country, or help build that movement. I don't see myself as being the one to build it.
You have a number of chapters
yes,
of People of
yes,
Organization for
yes,
Progress.
Yes.
Now they're spread.
Right. I'm the state chairman, People's Organization for Progress. We started out as a small collective in Newark, and now we have 9 branches around the state, including a branch in New York City. And the organization is growing, has grown over the years and continues to grow.
If you were to take on the challenge of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from the development and the organizational structure that you have already created, what would that challenge be?
The challenge really is to pick up where Dr. King left off. Because fundamentally, I think we've been in a holding pattern for 40 years. You know, the whole object of the FBI's COINTELPRO program was to destroy the leadership of the Black liberation movement and thereby disable it. The whole object was to, we had a movement in the 60s. We had a movement that was transforming America. That movement after World War II was the Civil Rights Movement. That was primarily the manifestation in the South. And it was the Black Power movement primarily, at least initially in the North, and then returning to the South. Because remember, the slogan Black Power started in the South. It started down there in Alabama. It didn't start up here, but it kind of picked up in the North because African Americans up here were more readily positioned to begin to elect black elected officials in large numbers. And that they did. The Civil Rights Movement made the franchise, that is the right to vote, possible for all African Americans. And the Black Power movement was the movement that enabled African Americans to use that franchise. So in 1966, a year after the Voting Rights Act was passed, there were less than 500 black elected officials in the United States of America. By 1972, which was the year of the Gary National Black Political Convention, there were over 10,000 black elected officials. So there was almost like a 100-fold increase. So the Civil Rights Movement got us the vote, and the Black Power movement, in the Black Power movement, we used that vote to get black political representation. But Dr. King, at the end of his life, he was not just trying to get civil rights and trying to get the right to vote. He wanted to change the condition of black people. He wanted to change the conditions that we lived in. And he believed that this could only be done at the time of his death. He believed that there had to be a massive government program.
And that's what you really...
Well, I believe that's part of it. I think that's where I have to add something to what each generation has to add its part,
Okay.
you know? So Dr. King, he, at the end of his life, Poor People's Movement, he was going to bring 1 million people to Washington to make Congress pass an economic bill of rights. The slogan was, believe it or not, jobs and income, one or the other. You know, jobs at a living wage and income at a living wage, one or the other, you know, to bring people out of poverty, to bring them out of unemployment. He wanted Congress to pass an economic bill of rights. So I believe the same thing. I believe that's still needed. I don't think that these problems, I mean, I got involved politically at the age of 17. And in many ways, conditions are worse. They're better in some ways, but they're also worse in some ways than they were at the time I was 17. It's clear to me that unless there's some drastic change, these problems will not only continue, they will get worse. In fact, if we don't do something in America very soon, we're going to have a caste system that looks very much like the caste system of India. You know the caste system?
No,
That's
no.
the class system in India that has existed for 3,000 years. And the underclass, the lower classes, are called the untouchables. And this is regulated by religion, but also it assumed an economic basis over time. So whereas you might have been born into the untouchable caste, you know, the religion said you could never leave your caste, but you might leave by getting a skill.
But you don't think our democracy would protect that from happening?
I think that if we are not careful, we're going to have an economic caste system where it will be nearly impossible, because already we see upward mobility being limited in the United States. It's already happening. First of all, the gap between rich and poor is wider than it's ever been. Our income inequality in the United States right now, on this day, is greater than the income inequality in the People's Republic of China and the income inequality in Iran. Now, a lot of people would find that hard to believe, but that's the truth. And what we have now, a phenomenon we see now, is not is not upward mobility. We actually see people falling out of their classes and into the lower classes. This will be the first generation where they will not live better than their parents, because the goal of each generation is to have their children live better than them. And for nearly 50 years, that was possible because the American economic system was so dominant, because we assumed that dominant position after World War II. Remember what happened? All the other industrial democracies of Europe got destroyed in World War II. We had to give them money to get back on their feet, so we were the dominant. So for 50 years, we actually could fulfill the promise. Well, I say that in a general sense because that wasn't happening for black people, but in a general sense, the U.S. could say that people's lives were improving with each generation. For the first time now, we see that is not the case. For the first time now, there will be a generation of people who will not live, who will not have more than their parents. Their parents may have owned a home, they may never own a home. Their parents got to get advanced degrees, they may never get advanced degrees. They may end up staying in their parents' house until their parents die. So this is what's happening in America now. We've hit a point of stagnation. In other words, we've kind of hit the roof, so to speak. And if we don't take steps to correct this, you know, we will have an economic caste system. We will have a system where it will be impossible for people to have a better life.
To focus on that positive definition, where do we need to be starting to put our efforts?
That's a hard question, but let me answer it in a way that may not be the direct answer to your question. The fundamental challenge that faces us today is to in fact build a movement that can move large numbers of people to apply the pressure that needs to be applied to government to make government do what we want it to do. Because government is not working in our interest. The political institutions and the economic institutions in this country are not functioning in the interests of the majority of people of this country. And it's able to do so. They are able to do so because we have not yet brought into being either those movements or those organizations that can put people at the ballot box, put feet in the street, and raise the money that it needs to raise to fund that kind of a movement. And until that happens, we're not going to see any change. We're going to see shadow play. We're going to see people talking about change. And we're going to see tokenism and things that might make people think there's change. But real and fundamental change is not going to happen. In fact, we stand on the precipice of possibly seeing the beginnings of some type of authoritarian police state in this country. Already we've seen the limits we've seen limits being placed on civil liberties and civil rights that we used to take for granted. Right now, since the president has signed the Defense Authorization Act, anyone can be proclaimed a terrorist. Any citizen, what was once illegal or at best in question, has now been made legal. People can be seized at any point, not charged with anything, detained in secret places, and kept for as long as they want to keep you.
You know, Mr. Hamm has often been a part of many of the initiatives that we have worked on, and certainly we are in support of what's going on with the days of protest, and we have been actively involved. Honk your horn is not what we're really looking for. We're looking for you to get out your car and spend 5-10 minutes, hold up a sign, show that what we're really doing is not only raising awareness, but creating the institutions necessary to see change in our communities. Larry, you know, I really appreciate you, sharing with me and me being able to draw as much out of you as I did.
Right.
You know, you're an incredible source of knowledge, and you have been a great inspiration to us in our community in terms of knowing how to continue to find a way to excite our young who are going to be the inheritance of what it is that we're doing, and they give us the courage and the bravery.
And that's the most important
thing.
thing.
Part of what it is that you're doing. I thank you very much for giving us the time to share this
with
our viewers. We'd like to thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll be looking forward for more opportunities where we can share these kinds of inspirational conversations with you. Thank you very much.